Hello, my name is John Roskam. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and this is a special edition of Free Voices, coming to you from the Baillieu Myer studio in the Melbourne offices of the IPA, where I'm talking with the Honourable Tony Abbott, Distinguished Fellow of the Institute of Public Affairs. I'll be talking to Tony about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, world events, a recent speech he made in Budapest, and I'll be also discussing with him what does this mean for the West and the future of liberal democracy as we know it. Tony, welcome in these difficult circumstances.
John, as always, it's good to be with you. Wonderful to be a part of the IPA, and I'm sorry that these are grim times and it's a pretty distressing topic that we've got to discuss today.
Now, you've returned a few days ago from Europe. Can you tell us what you were doing in Europe? What was the feeling in Europe? And then I'll ask you about the significant speech you delivered in Budapest.
Yes, John, I was in Budapest. I was there at the invitation of the Danube Institute, which is run by John O'Sullivan, a former Margaret Thatcher political advisor, former editor of Quadrant here in Australia, a very distinguished and I think a remarkable individual. And he's created a little, cabal of English-speaking intellectuals in the heart of Central Europe there in Budapest. And he was good enough to invite me over to talk about the security situation. So the speech I gave last Monday, 2 or 3 days before the actual Russian invasion of Ukraine took place, was an assessment of the situation on the ground right then. And I regret to say that my assessment a few days later was borne out by facts. I said in that speech that it was certain that Putin wanted to restore Greater Russia, that Ukraine was his immediate target, but that it was very unlikely to be his final target, that once Ukraine had become again a Russian colony, he would look to other countries that had been part of Greater Russia, such as the Baltic states, such as Poland, with the ultimate objective of trying to re-establish Russian overlordship in Eastern Europe. Now, I think what we're seeing bears that out almost precisely. The one encouraging thing that we've seen since last Thursday is the strength of the Ukrainian resistance. Outgunned, outnumbered, certainly vastly inferior in terms of technology, but they've shown a wonderful, heroic fighting spirit from the president down. The fact that President Zelensky, who's Jewish, by the way, a Russian-speaking Jewish Eastern Ukrainian.
Child of Holocaust survivors.
I mean, you know, this unhinged nonsense from Putin that somehow the Ukrainian government is a semi-Nazi government is exposed as a complete fraud by the fact that it's led by a Russian-speaking Eastern Ukrainian Jew. Anyway, his contemptuous response to the risible suggestion from President Biden that he should be given a lift out of the country. I want arms, not a ride. I want weapons and not a ride. Wonderful, defiant gesture. The Ukrainian border guards who told the Russians to get effed. The Ukrainian soldier who late was destroying a bridge and was prepared to sacrifice himself to achieve that military objective. There's no doubt about the spirit of the Ukrainians, and I've got to say, I think we can learn from the heroism of a free people under fire.
And I'll draw on your speech in a moment. Can I ask you about the invasion? Did you have any inkling it would come just a few days after you warned of it, and what was your reaction when you learned of it?
I had no insider knowledge. All I had was my own sense of how things were bound to develop based on what all of us knew from the reports. Now, a lot of very sophisticated people were saying, Putin's very clever. He's just doing all this as an elaborate game of bluff to try to intimidate the Ukrainians into acceding to his requests, which would have effectively ended the independence of the Ukraine. My sense of the Ukrainians was that they were not going to be bluffed into surrendering their freedom and independence, and that Putin was not going to give up. He wasn't going to be sweet-talked by President Macron or President Biden or the British Foreign Secretary or anyone out of his messianic megalomaniac objectives. So I was shocked when it actually happened, as you are, when momentous and grim events take place, but I was in no way surprised. You do not invade Georgia, effectively occupy the Donbass. You do not exploit every ethnic crisis in the old Soviet Union for years, as Putin had done, if you don't have a very, very firm objective in place. So the long and inexorable military build-up indicated to me that this guy was serious, and this wasn't a charade, it was for real.
Without wishing to embarrass you, can I ask you a question that many IPA members have asked and many members of the public have thought about, which is, why did it take a former Australian Prime Minister to go to Europe to speak the seeming truth? Is it something that people in Europe were afraid to understand? Is it something that they regard themselves as complicit in, and so they can't speak what now, 1 week on, seems to be not just a significant speech, but a speech that, as you said, was in many ways obvious?
Yeah, in some ways, John, it's easier for an ex-PM to talk than a serving PM, because serving PMs have got a whole lot of responsibilities and they've got a whole lot of interests that they need to take into account. But the one thing we can never succumb to, or we should never succumb to, is wishful thinking, and it's too easy to indulge wishful thinking.
Has Europe been too engaged in wishful thinking for the last decade or two?
Well, if I can briefly digress, all of us, myself included, were guilty of wishful thinking in respect of China. It became fairly obvious from 2015 onwards, with the militarisation of the South China Sea, that the steady convergence of systems was not taking place, certainly wasn't taking place in the way we thought, that China would become more liberal.
Capitalism wasn't bringing democracy.
Exactly right. The Chinese methods might have been contaminating us, but our freedoms weren't taking on there to anything like the same extent. So yes, there was a degree of wishful thinking, and the other problem was that so much of Western Europe and Central Europe had become so energy dependent on Russia. So how do you avoid having to increase military spending? How do you avoid having to diversify your energy sources? How do you avoid having to talk frankly to your own people about the sacrifices that might be required of them? Well, by pretending that there's no strategic challenge. And I think that's the trap that so many of the West's leaders have fallen into. And I absolutely can understand why it happens. But, you know, I'm trying to remember my exact words to the Australian Parliament on the morning of July the 17th, 2014, after MH17 shot down. I think I said something like this: the bullying of small countries by big ones, the trampling of justice and decency for national aggrandisement, and the reckless indifference to human life should have no place in our world. Now, that's what I said then, and we weren't quite so sure back then exactly what had happened. It was obvious even then that the plane had been shot down by Russian-backed rebels. We didn't know at that stage that it was actually a Russian missile battery that had done the dread deed. But that was what I said then, because it was obvious what was happening, even back then in 2014, that this was the bullying of a small country by a big one. And to me, the disappointment of the intervening 8 years is that not nearly enough has been done to reduce the ability of Russia to bully its neighbours and to prepare and strengthen its neighbours to protect their freedom.
You entitled your speech, "The Revenge of History." Why did you call it that?
Well, it was a title that was originally suggested to me by the redoubtable John O'Sullivan, and I thought it was a good title because you and I are old enough to remember, John, the euphoria that greeted the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And the optimism and the hope.
Exactly right.
That liberal democracy would succeed everywhere.
Exactly right. I was at university in the late 70s and we saw the fall of Vietnam, the communisation of parts of Africa.
And then we saw Central America.
And then, of course, we saw the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We saw, Marxist takeovers in parts of Central America. So the late 70s were pretty grim times for the liberal democracies. But then, of course, thanks to Thatcher, Reagan and John Paul II, in large measure, we had this extraordinary moment when the Berlin Wall fell and it did appear that liberal capitalism was triumphant. And Francis Fukuyama declared that history had ended with the triumph of liberal capitalism. Sure, things would happen, but essentially there would be no further argument about the fundamentals. Now, if only, we saw not long afterwards, we saw the rise of Islamist terror. And I guess while the West has been distracted by that for much of the past 2 decades, we've seen Russia and more particularly China emerge as massive strategic competitors to the West, and they certainly don't accept that liberal capitalism is or should be triumphant.
Did Fukuyama and that idea that liberal democracy was inevitable make us complacent?
I think it did, and I'm not really being critical of Fukuyama because...
And all of us who wanted Fukuyama to be right.
Yeah, because, yes, I mean, he articulated a hope, but the hope has turned out to be triumphalist folly. And I guess the truth is that human nature doesn't change. Elemental competition between peoples and states doesn't go away. The great thing about the Anglo-American world order, which one way or another has largely prevailed for the last 2 centuries, is that it is a benign order which respects the rights of individuals, that respects the rights of states, provided they don't unduly interfere with the equal rights of other states. But there are these massive contemporary challenges to it. And what we've seen in Ukraine is a particularly vicious, blatant and flagrant challenge to the benign liberal assumptions under which we've lived for the best part of the last 70 years.
Can I ask you about one of the sentences from your speech? And it was this: perhaps this military crisis might awaken the people of Western countries so recently discombobulated by a virus and so unaccustomed to sacrifice, to how readily a freedom that's not cherished and defended can be lost? Is there a broader point about our freedoms to be made?
Well, we have so taken them for granted. We have so taken them for granted. And if you look at the public discourse of Western countries, particularly the English-speaking countries, over the last couple of decades, it's been dominated by climate change, by identity politics, and by an extraordinary degree of cultural self-flagellation. Now, I'm not for a second saying that we're perfect and that we can't improve, but Western countries have never been less racist. Minorities have never got a fairer go than they do now, and yet the sense of anger and outrage over perceived slights and injustices has never been greater. We've just got to get a grip, frankly, and see things in better perspective.
So you're saying our priorities over the last decade of social policy, cultural policy, economic policy might have been misplaced?
I think at times we have allowed ourselves to worry over relative trivia. I mean, the phrase first world problems, only countries that have no serious issues can fret over some of these things. And we now do have serious issues. And the point I might have made a couple of times now is that, let's try to reduce our emissions. But when it comes to scary futures and scary prospects, war with a superpower is a lot scarier than a couple of degrees of temperature increase several decades hence.
So many Western countries have committed to net zero. Is net zero something we can afford? Is net zero a threat to our and other countries' national security?
I think net zero is a wonderful aspiration, and at some point in time, thanks to the march of technology, I'm sure we'll be able to get there. What we shouldn't do is put a timeline on net zero that means that its achievement substantially weakens countries like ours economically and ultimately militarily as well. Why is Europe so dependent upon Russian gas? Because they've closed down their nuclear stations, they've closed down their coal-fired power stations, they have become more and more reliant on weather-dependent wind and solar power. When the wind won't blow and the sun won't shine, they need a backup, and that's Russian gas. And so it's the drive to net zero which has helped to make Western and Central Europe so dependent on Russian gas, which has made them so strategically vulnerable and has so compromised and complicated their reaction to the crisis on the borders of Ukraine. Now, I think very late in the day, they're waking up to it. The Germans have just, it seems, committed to reducing, if not ending, their dependence upon Russian gas. The Germans appear to have committed to a rapid increase in their military spending. They've said that they're going to dispatch some lethal weaponry to Ukraine. So let's hope they have woken up to themselves. But gee whiz, it's late and it's been a long time coming.
Can I ask you about two final topics? The relationship between Russia and China and the connection, if any, between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Chinese threats to Taiwan.
At the beginning of the Winter Olympics in China, President Putin and President Xi Jinping had a kind of a summit, and they released a grandiose joint declaration, International Relations for a New Era, I think they titled it. And bizarrely, they claimed in this pact or declaration that Russia and China both had long-standing democratic traditions. Well, this is absolutely fatuous, and you only have to ask Navalny, the jailed opposition leader in Russia, or Cheng Lei, the jailed Australian-Chinese news anchor in Beijing, what the democratic liberal traditions of those countries are. So look, the whole thing was fatuous, but what was clear from this declaration was that Russia was giving China a free hand in Asia, and China was giving Russia a free hand in Europe. So this is a new axis, if you like, a bit like the Berlin-Tokyo axis of old. And I think we can be confident that China will take advantage of, it will exploit any opportunities that the distraction in Europe creates, and Russia will exploit any opportunities that distraction in Asia creates. And it's interesting that what Putin's doing now in Ukraine follows on from the scuttle from Kabul and the Americans' reiteration that they are not going to worry about anything much except China. Well, you focus on China, there's a breakout from Russia. You focus on Russia, there could easily be a breakout from China.
Now, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you the unknowable question as to whether the Russian invasion of Ukraine would have happened under Donald Trump. But I will ask you, is there a view that America is not the force for good, stability in the liberal international order that it once was?
You can understand the Americans feeling that they've carried this heavy burden for a long time without a lot of thanks. There's no doubt whatsoever that America has paid a high price in blood and treasure for the benign global order that has enabled so many countries to be freer, richer and safer than ever before. So absolutely understandable. I can remember President Obama's famous West Point speech back in 2014, where he said America can't be the world's policeman on its own. And I made a speech in Washington a few weeks later, which was my own little counterpoint to that speech, where I said that America need not be the world's policeman on its own, because while America would have more important allies and more powerful allies than Australia, America would never have a more reliable ally than Australia. And I said to the president back then in the middle of 2014, as the Islamic State crisis was bursting upon the Middle East, that Australia would be there in support with all we had to give. And I think we did play at least a proportionate part in responding to that. So look, I think there is this sense that America is a bit of a weary giant, a weary and distracted giant. I think there is this sense, I think I may even have said this myself in a subsequent speech in Washington, there's this sense that the legions are coming home. It's easy to be critical of America. It's easy to say that the American-led world has had many faults, but if America ever really goes, we'll miss her.
Finally, turning to Australia, what should Australia do for Ukraine? And where do the events of the last few weeks leave Australia in the context of our geopolitical environment?
To be honest, John, I think the West could have done more to prevent this invasion. I know there's a lot of nervousness about boots on the ground, but I think there were other things that could have been done to deter Putin short of putting Western soldiers onto the borders of Ukraine. For instance, why wasn't consideration given to the declaration of a no-fly zone over the Ukraine? Just said, look, Russian military aircraft will not be allowed to fly into Ukrainian airspace, and anti-missile systems will be activated to help prevent missile attacks on the Ukraine. I think that could have been done. Now, I know Russia keeps talking about NATO's aggression. NATO is a defensive alliance, and if tactical missiles had been placed by NATO in any of the frontline states, the Baltic states, Poland, or indeed in Ukraine, you could understand the Russians' concern in the same way that the Americans were concerned when Russian tactical or at least intermediate missiles appeared in Cuba. But I think there could have been a much more robust initial response to the Russian build-up. And when President Biden said a month or so back that there may not be any reaction to a so-called minor incursion, I know, well, I think he misspoke, and the record was corrected shortly afterwards, but
the damage was done.
It was hard not to think that there was almost an amber light given. Certainly not a red light.
What should Australia do? How can we be part of the international community in this regard?
Well, again, as a significant middle power, there's not a lot that we can do on our own at that distance, but in conjunction with our principal allies, particularly Britain and the United States, there's always work that could be done, and certainly we should always be talking to Britain and the United States about a very robust approach to the defence of freedom. That's what I did when I was Prime Minister in respect of Islamic State, and I hope that's what we're doing now. Certainly the fact that Prime Minister Morrison was able to pull off the AUKUS agreement and also help revitalise the Quad suggests to me that inside the councils of the West, our voice is as robust as any.
And in conclusion, I won't ask you how this may end. What do you see for the future in the coming weeks and months?
There's no doubt that the armed forces and people of Ukraine are carrying freedom's flag right now. And all I can do is wish them every success and hope that they are given every tangible support and encouragement. Now, I'm pleased that Australia is helping now to supply lethal weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces, and I think the greater the support we can give them, the greater encouragement they will gain, because we have to hope that they can keep up this resistance until such time as the Russian forces start to lose heart, and perhaps there starts to be some blowback on President Putin back home, because in the end, what we need is a different attitude from Russia to that which we've currently got.
Tony Abbott, Distinguished Fellow at the IPA, thank you for joining us on this special edition of Free Voices.